So as we know, to create this economic growth in our cities, we need human and financial capital. So this next session is comprised of people who are experts in the models and partnerships that will attract the investments and the talent to build the 21st century innovation city.
Ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome Jason Myers, who is CEO of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters in Canada. It's one of the biggest associations in Canada. Alan Broadbent, who's chair of the Maytree Foundation and Havana Capital Corporation. He is a leading innovator in using private capital for social good. Lorne Braithwaite is CEO of Build Toronto, which takes municipal land. His job is to take municipal land and turn it into positive investments. And of course, Jaana Remes. The session moderator is Ann Golden, who's worn so many urban hats in this city and has made a great contribution. She has just stepped down as President and CEO of the Conference Board of Canada and is currently a scholar in residence at Ryerson University. All yours.
Thanks so much, David, and thank you very much. Very excited to be chairing this session, and I just want to make a few quick points before we turn to some very interesting questions. What struck me in the first part of this is we have made tremendous intellectual progress in understanding the role that cities and city regions are playing. When I think back, 15, 20 years ago, we were not there. But I use the word intellectual progress because we've made much more intellectual progress than we have in really internalizing what these insights mean around the role of city regions, innovation, and reducing the productivity growth gap. And so that's why we want our session to make to be very specific and be quite practical in its approach. Two studies that we did recently at the conference board. One was on hub cities. It created a stir because it showed that and the people from FCM may find this uncomfortable, but it did show that the major cities or hub cities not only raised the GDP of the country disproportionately, but actually helped to lift the GDP within the surrounding regions. And the case was being made for strategic investment in major cities. A new study just came out in May. You may not be aware of it. And it's the role of Canada's major cities in attracting foreign direct investment. Usually we analyze investment flows from a national perspective. First time we've done it from a city perspective. We kind of knew that it was the cities that were attracting most of the investment money, but now we know for sure, and we have the data to show it. And there are a lot of implications arising from that around how we do economic development in cities, and by cities I really mean city regions, and their role at the table when they meet with provincial and federal levels of government, and what we should change. But the point is, cities do play a key role, and this was pointed out. So our questions try to build on the insights, and I attended specifically session 2 chaired by John Tory yesterday because I saw it as a prelude to this session. We have a fantastic panel, and I've developed some, I think, pithy questions for them. So my first question, and it's going to be a little bit of a surprise to them because they don't have a copy of this, although I've shared a bit. Since we know that most investment flows through cities, actually globally and in Canada, most innovation occurs in cities, but we also know that cities have neither the money, and certainly FCM's new president pointed that out this morning, nor the governance systems, discussed at length yesterday, to support this mandate. And given that we can't change the Constitution, this is a continuation from yesterday, what must change and how? And I'm going to start off with Jay. I'm going to give each member of the panel a chance to answer each of my questions, but then I want to have time within our 50 minutes to move to the audience. Jay, what do we have to change specifically?
Well, let me say, first of all, I think this is it's a crucial question because we've got lots of ideas, lots of dreams, and at the end of the day, vision without money is simply hallucination. So we need to be focusing on where the money comes from and how do we ensure that that money is invested in the strategic infrastructure that we need to build cities and the innovation infrastructure around that. I think first of all it starts with leadership, both in terms of strategic leadership and focusing on what the power of cities is all about and how that builds innovation, how innovation then interacts with economic development. Strategic leadership in the way of actually focusing on what is core in this whole in this whole business.
You mean leadership at the municipal level or all levels?
I mean leadership at all levels.
Yeah,
leadership,
yeah.
political leadership, but also leadership in the business community, leadership in the social community as well. To focus on the importance of interaction, of personal interaction, whether that's building infrastructure, communications infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, community infrastructure, but that's the core of this business, I think, and also doing it in an informed way, building on some of the analysis we've heard this morning, but actually doing it in a way that is reflective of the changes that are going on in society and the economy as a whole. I think just on the political side, we're talking about an urban network. So we've got to be talking about political structures that at least work together, both across departments and across municipalities. We have to be talking about a political system that is responsive, can respond quickly to changing requirements.
So this theme of alignment came up quite a bit yesterday. Alan?
Well, it's interesting you raise the Constitution. Most Canadians' eyes glaze over when you raise the Constitution. I think you and I and perhaps David are among the few our eyes light up when we talk about the Constitution. But as people, I think, are generally aware, in our constitutional arrangement, cities are, since 1867, have been creatures of the provinces. And we've had a couple of really nasty brushes with the Constitution, particularly around Quebec and around Charlottetown and Meech Lake. And so we tend not to want to go near the Constitution and try and make constitutional change. But what we have done successfully in this country is to change our governmental arrangements. So we pretend that we're not going to change anything and we're going to obey the constitutions. But if you look at the accommodations that have been made for Quebec over the years, if you look at the change in our approach to First Nations and self-government among First Nations, we, on a regular basis, successfully change our governmental arrangements.
So what do we need to change now?
So with cities, you know, one of the great examples that Brock Carlton and people at FCM will be aware of, in the environmental funding that came through 15 years ago, it was done through FCM because the federal government is reluctant to intrude in areas where the province has jurisdiction, but they're quite prepared to do things that they can deal directly with people, and most of their funding programs are directly with people, or they can deal through intermediary organizations. And so I think we can deal with some of the issues that Jay's talked about in terms of fiscal capacity through a change of arrangements without having to get into a constitutional hassle about it. And I think if we work down that kind of channel, it's going to be much more productive.
Okay, thank you. I'll start, Jaana.
Well, let me draw on global examples on this one. In a way,
yes.
Where have been really seen effective ways of getting things done in cities? That really is what is it about. In a way, how can you get things done that we all know? It's not that we don't know what needs to get done, but how to get it done. I think there are some examples like China where that has been the explicit policy of putting cities to compete for government support for certain industries. That may or may not be an option for other regions. But I think the most interesting examples to draw lessons on are cities that are in countries where you typically don't see a strong performance, and these cities shine. And interestingly, there is one pattern we notice that's different, and it is that the government and the businesses work very well together. And let me give you two examples from regions that are typically not used as examples. One of them would be Latin America. The two very high-performing cities, there are Medellin and Monterrey, both known for the business and government collaborations. In Monterrey, the biggest example is education, for example. The private sector has been heavily behind technical education. In Medellin, since the 50s and 60s, the business community has been behind solving social issues, everything from childcare to healthcare. So I think that is one example in Latin America. Another one, it comes from my native Finland. Oulu, a small town with no comparative advantages of any kind. Yet it became one of the wireless hubs with the rise of Nokia. And it was largely because the government, the university, and the private sector with Nokia's leadership, they just came together. I know this for a fact. They had the sauna evening every 6 months to go and figure out what needed to get done and who's going to do what to get it done. And that really was the collaboration between those parties that made a big difference for that to be one of the great examples of cluster growth. So just to the question, I think there is a single answer for cities. Cities are very diverse. You need to find of your city what needs to be done to get things done. And I think the public-private collaboration that you also referred to is going to be and will be critical.
Lorne, we've talked about public-private, and on this particular question, I'll let you be the last speaker on this one, and I'll let you lead off on the next question.
All right, thank you very much, Anne. If you look around the world right now, there are 65 major cities that have moved forward on a phenomenal basis in terms of public transportation. And they've done it with an integrated model between the private sector and the public sector. And they have sat down and figured out, governance-wise, how can we organize that in a partnership arrangement that allows the expertise of the private sector to go out and make it happen. And yet the public sector is still comfortable that they have their say at the table in terms of governance. And that is my main idea in terms of how do you solve this problem that you're talking about. Real estate is an underutilized category dramatically in all the major cities because real estate is long-term. The cycle is 4 to 6 years. It's knowledge intense, capital intense, risky, etc. So it's out of sync with the political cycle of 4 years. So that's a very difficult model to figure out. There are many cities that have figured it out. Let's take New York. The New York Port Authority has a balance sheet of $20 billion. They've been doing it for a long time. And it's a hybrid model that uses the skill set that's required in terms of the private sector. And they've learned how to do it in a governance model of a combination of the two. So when you look at Toronto, there is a huge opportunity that we are just in the early stages of breaking down a number of the silos that have been prevalent over many years in terms of our historical forms of government looking back. And not that there's anything wrong with those. They've been great and they've served us well, but we have to do it different going forward.
Is Build Toronto trying to develop or work on these kinds of models?
Absolutely. That's basically the overview of the format of Build Toronto. We have a board of 12 people, and 6 of them are the best experts we can find in real estate in this country, and the other 6 are basically from the public side.
Excellent. So I like the way we're getting into some very specific examples, both in terms of cities and models. The next question was developed by the conference developers, Myro and Mark, so I've included it. How can Western cities attract the capital they need? Those of us that have been looking at cities for a long time, you can't, whenever you talk about growth of cities, one of the points always made is that we don't have enough, whether it's true or it is, we don't have enough venture capital. There's a problem attracting the venture capital, or if government's providing venture capital, we do it in the wrong way. We feed the startups, we starve the ones that are going to be successful, and we don't have the right, we don't distribute it in the right way. Lorne, how can Western cities attract the capital they need?
Well, I would look at it slightly different. I don't think it's an issue of attracting capital. In fact, money will follow or find a good project. If you've got a good project, you're going to have no trouble attracting capital. So I think you have to approach it from that perspective. If you have the other perspective, attracting capital, you got a bag of money and then you say, I got to spend it somewhere. And if you don't have a good project to invest in, then you're making a mistake. You're making a serious mistake. So I would give you a short answer saying we want good projects that are well thought out, good governance models that are researched properly in terms of the market opportunity, and then the capital is not a problem.
If we have time, I want to come back to the whole issue of economic development here in Toronto, the Toronto Region Research Alliance, which was trying, and the GTMA, and I don't know if you're familiar with those examples, but they were trying to attract investment. It wasn't, I think it broke down because we didn't have collaboration. I don't know if you're familiar with those examples.
Not directly familiar, but over the years in terms of the development work that I've been doing in my career for the last 35 years, I've been exposed to a lot of that, and it keeps coming back to the number one thing. If you have a good project, you're not going to have trouble with capital. Capital is fluid. Capital never sleeps. Capital goes across borders. So if you've got a good project and a good idea, capital will be there.
Alan.
It's interesting. I agree with what Lorne is saying on this. It's interesting in the spring budget, the federal government established a $400 million fund to stimulate venture capital and stimulate a venture capital industry in Canada. And they have been consulting widely with people in the venture capital community. And I've been in a number of those discussions. And generally, the conclusion of the discussions is that we don't have a shortage of capital for venture capital. We have a shortage of investable projects, to your point, Lorne, and we have a shortage of venture capitalists, people who are really, have the risk tolerance and like that kind of knife edge existence, and but capital itself is not an issue. I would also differentiate, Lorne, between venture capital and capital for development projects, which is
yes,
a much more, I think, much more stable capital market.
Yeah, I would agree, and just a further point of an explanation on that. If you have a stable market and a stable development program, you can often do the cross-partnership transition with, guarantees from the public sector, but actually driven by the private sector. And that really is part of the model that's used on many of the P3s.
Yeah, yeah.
And they're quite successful.
Yeah.
So actually there's been a shift of thinking then very recently, because I can say for the last decade there's been so much written on we haven't got enough venture capital or we're doing it wrong. But personally, in my interviews and meeting with people, they all said it's not a question of the money, it's a question of having the great projects. So it's interesting, and I know, Jaana, we talked before, and that, did you want to make a point on that? I know you agree with...
Actually, if I can do quickly 2 points on that.
Yes.
First of all, on the fact that it is, I fully agree, and I think it's a question of productivity. So productivity will be increasingly challenged for developed economies, as aging means that the labor input growth is going to be slower. So it's productivity, productivity, productivity. And on your second point on attracting inward investment, I think one of the things that a lot of cities don't realize, that you are no longer competing just with the next city, and benchmarking on what they are doing is not the way to go. Let me tell you, companies typically think of their where they invest. I'm not talking about venture capital, I'm talking about the physical investments. They think of it as in a funnel, in a way. You know you need to put a plant or an operations in a certain region. You have a long list of cities that you kind of think, these are the ones that I will look at and I will assess. Then very systematically, typically analyze some of the facts of costs and talent and connections and network, etc., depending on what the business is, and they come to a short list of 2 to 5 businesses. And that is a very analytic process. And of the 2 to 5 last ones, the choice is often made based on where I want to travel, where my wife wants to bring up the kids, where my husband really finds his a job that's appropriate for him. So I think the question of attracting businesses to your nation, we really need to know at which point that funnel you fail. Is it because you are not visible enough? People don't know about your city. It may be the case for some Canadian cities. For many, it won't be. But then knowing exactly where in that funnel you have a challenge. And the benchmark today is set by Singapore and Ireland, who roll out the red carpet, who have...
Singapore and?
Ireland.
Right.
Dublin, in many ways. It is, they have hundreds and thousands of people, hundreds and or thousands, depending on how you define people as a sales force effectively, analyzing companies who are looking to invest, developing very detailed proposals of how to attract them, finding ways to resolve their issues when they have any, to the extent that the famous case is perhaps when Intel made their plant in Ireland and they were worried they didn't have enough talent. The Irish Development Agency, they came back and said, give me a little time and I'll come back with the proposal on how we can solve that. They came back with 85 names, emails, and phones of people who had semiconductor-specific experience around the globe, largely Irish Americans who said, Irish expatriates in North America, but also elsewhere, and said, all of these people are willing to relocate if you need more people in Ireland. So that is the competition you are against.
And they all love to party late at night. I used to live in Ireland for 3 years, and boy, they make a lot of noise on the street.
Jay?
I think the issue about attracting investment is very important, and certainly cities offer a very attractive pool for that. But there's also the issue about how do we develop business, and I think the nature of business is changing, and I think that's very important in terms of our models of collaboration, the opportunities for collaboration, and the nature of our public-private partnerships as well. Companies regard manufacturing, clearly technology, but also a number of various services companies located in an urban area. They're having to compete like they've never competed before. They need to innovate. Nobody can take on the risk themselves. That just builds the rationale for collaboration. And I think the issue here is how do we make that collaborative model part of the business model for any business? How every business will be looking at the bottom line at the end of the day, the return on investment, where we are going to be able to form clusters, where we're going to be able to take advantage of the innovation base is where that can actually help business succeed on a global basis. To me, this issue is very much like the issue of how do we commercialize research. We've got all of these great people. We've got great infrastructure. How do we then translate that into a commercializable business model? And then we can begin to build the collaborative networks that I think we need to build.
Alan, closing comment on this question.
I thought Jaana's description of a company's process in making these decisions was very, very useful. In the Canadian context, the sort of marketing platform for this kind of choice is really made by the provinces. That they're the ones that are going to create the education system that turns out the high quality of graduates that are going to be the employees of these companies when they come. They're the ones who create the social capital around things like healthcare systems and livable communities and the rest of it. When you come down to the end of that short list and you're one of those 2 cities or 3 cities that's being considered, you then start to say, who's got the sales tools to be actually able to go through the door and make that attractive proposition? And those are largely with the municipalities. They're things like property tax concessions or fee concessions or aids in infrastructure development or whatever it is. And so when we talk about regional in terms of our aspirations and how we deal with these issues and sell the region, we should really keep in mind that those kinds of instruments, those sales tools, don't exist at the regional level. They exist at the municipal level. They're through the authority of municipal governments. And if we're going to actually have a truly regional approach, we have to consider how we align those sales tools with the geography that we're talking about. And I think we all understand that we operate as a region, whether it be the Toronto region or the Vancouver Lower Mainland region or whatever it is. But we need to get over that bridge that we have a misalignment of our authorities and our necessary tools.
Alan, a related add-on comment, something that we're doing within Build that's very creative in that area. We're taking unproductive real estate, turning it into residential for entry-level home ownership, and then taking the value of the land, which has been sitting producing nothing for 40 years often, putting it in a zero coupon mortgage that when you put someone in there on a basis of what they can afford, and it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, when they sell it, then we get the second mortgage out. Right. That's a little creative, a little different, and I think we need more of that.
I want to bring that idea forward again when we come to my question on social issues, Lorne, as well.
Okay, sorry.
What Alan's, the points that have been made resonate very personally with me because when I had the chance to look at the GTA through the task force that I led, and I know it was 17 years ago, but the whole theme that we have to be able to collaborate as a city region, and the fact that we haven't got the economic geography does not coincide with the political reality, and of course that was the purpose of the whole report, which didn't get fully implemented, and I'm getting over that.
Almost.
Almost. But the second point is we had the chance. I interviewed with, not me personally, but we interviewed 85 chief executive officers, and I went down to the locator firms in our total market, which is northeastern America and into the upper New York State. And when it got down to sure, we had the broad pillars, the broad cornerstones, but when we got down to the last decision point, what would make you not come to Toronto or come to Toronto? 2 points. The just-in-time amenities, where do I want my kids to go to school? Because most CEOs have kids in high school, they're in their 40s, 50s. And secondly, infrastructure. The biggest single issue I heard at that time, which has been sort of corrected, is we had a terrible airport at that point. And they would not come to Toronto because they couldn't stand the airport experience. And so infrastructure matters, which comes back to a point that you made, Jaana, in your opening presentation. And all these questions are interconnected. But as you said, rising consumer demand requires infrastructure investment. And to come back to what FCM presented this morning, Karen, we don't have the money to do it. So to me, I always come back to that, but that's just a little interjection. And moving ahead now to my third question. Toronto has more high-rise development under construction than any city in the world. It's quite staggering. We have, Lorne told me, 195 projects at this point in time under construction. I mean, that's just unbelievable. So my question to my panel is this a good thing? Why is this happening? What did we do right, if it is a good thing? And what needs to happen and change? And the last part of that question, what needs to happen, is specifically what needs to happen. Lorne, I'll start with you, and then we'll move around the panel.
Well, I think what's going on, Anne's right that there's 195 under construction right now. That's double what it was last year.
Phenomenal.
And what's happened out in the marketplace is what I would call kind of the perfect storm. You had, locally, you have a situation where a lot of the tenants that have been dominant in the downtown commercial office towers, banks, real estate, insurance companies, consulting, they, about 10 years ago, decided they were going to vacate, they were going to diversify and put some of their growth out in Mississauga and other areas because the tax rates were so high downtown and it was often getting more difficult to get people to work in the downtown core, etc. That has all changed for a variety of reasons. One of it is the disappearance of the middle class, where the middle class cannot afford two cars. So if you can't afford two cars, you better be on a subway or you better live downtown. So that's part of the process. And the brick users of office space have decided that they're going to come back into the downtown. So the conditions have changed. What that does, we went for 10 years with no office tower construction. Now there's a huge number of office towers under construction. That's creating jobs. So the youth, you take the perfect storm in terms of the affordability of the middle class, you take the growing office tower environment downtown, and you add on top of that, those two issues, the international environment where everybody is taking a look at, do I invest in Europe? Problem. Do I invest in the US? Is the US dollar going to stay? Or do I invest in a commodity-driven country that is being supported very strongly by the growth of India and China, and you have a perfect storm. You have capital coming here. Capital is not a problem. That isn't where you put your time and effort.
Is this a good thing, or could the question really, because we know a lot of these condos are being bought up and are not being inhabited by owners who live here, could this bust this whole condo market?
Well, the condo market historically has been a boom-bust business. But that hasn't happened in the last 10 years, I think primarily because of the stability of low interest rates, a very, very stable low interest rate environment. There are some downsides to it, but I think the downsides are minimal in terms of you have to accommodate these people. You got to have schools, you got to have other infrastructure to support it. What a wonderful problem to have that you're growing too quickly. I think we have the technology and the talent base as a country to deal with that. So I think it's very positive. And once you get more residential people living in the downtown core, you're going to get more business because business is going to follow that opportunity.
So Lorne, what you're describing is not something that we did right as a municipality, but a convergence of a variety of forces where we lucked out.
I guess you could say that.
All right.
I'd like to say it was pretty good planning.
And combined with excellent planning. What still needs to happen or change to sustain this momentum if we want to, or to prevent it from dipping? A lot of talk and articles about it dipping. So.
Well, I think the key thing, one of the key things, there's more than just one, but interest rates. If interest rates start to rise fairly aggressively, and once they do, that can happen.
Well, that's predicted for after 2014.
That market will dry up pretty quickly. That's one thing. I think the other thing that has to happen is that we have to get, we the Toronto region, have to get to work, if you will, in providing the associated infrastructure that's required to accommodate all that growth.
So back to infrastructure. Any other comments?
I love Lorne's reaction to this has just been a perfect illustration of something I've been observing for the last little while, is that when you say to somebody in the public sector, we've got 1 million more people that we're going to have to deal with in the next few years, they go, oh my God, what a problem. And when you go to somebody in the business community, they say, that's 1 million more customers. This is fantastic. You know? and it is a little bit of that issue. It depends who you talk to. You know, one of the great things that's happened in Toronto in the last 50 years is immigration. And the fact that we've had this really robust immigration. We've taken about half the immigrants that have come to Canada have come to the Toronto region. And it's been a huge factor in creating a robust market for real estate and for all sorts of other things. And if there is a fear around this condo boom and a potential, you know, that investors are buying them and there's not going to be people living in them in 10 years or whatever that fear might be, one of the ways we can intercede in that is to go back to an attitude of previous federal governments of welcoming immigration and being friendly and hospitable to immigrants, and more than that, creating the instruments to make them succeed, and that's kind of an almost hidden issue when we talk a lot about cities, about urban life in Canada, about infrastructure issues and all the rest of it. But part of this is creating the instruments to help people succeed, and building housing for them is one of those.
So Alan, that's a perfect segue to my question on social issues. Yesterday, the session that I observed the session to, there was absolute consensus that the whole issue of social cohesion, social inclusion is critical to attracting the labor that we need, critical to success of cities, and yet the problems were raised. Growing income gap, you remember those of you that were here yesterday, the loss of middle class, or the decline of middle class dominated neighborhoods, which concerns me because that was always Toronto's hallmark, really. We were a city of neighborhoods and largely middle class neighborhoods. The shortage of affordable housing was mentioned briefly, but the growing income gap was certainly raised. And so I want to start with you, Alan, on, as part of the economic development question, as part of the economy, how should we address these issues? Specifically, how do we do more in investing in troubled neighborhoods, which we're doing some? How do we, your thoughts on income gap? I know you have thoughts on mentoring and training and leadership development, because I'm very aware of the work where you have played such an important leader through Maytree and through civic action. So I'll start with you. We'll move a little bit on the social questions, and then I have one last very important question before we move to the audience, and I'll let Jaana be the lead.
Well, I think that in many ways we have some models of small programs in leadership training and connecting immigrants to the labor market, skilled immigrants to the labor market, which we can take and we can move out into other areas. So connecting marginalized communities, particularly young people in marginalized communities to the labor market. I think there are models that we can work on. But when I look at social issues and what I think the big social issues are, I don't think they're all that different from what the big economic issues are. I think that if somebody were to ask me what are the three most important economic issues and social issues, I would say they're transit, housing, and immigrant settlement and inclusion. I think those are our big three issues. They're important social issues for reasons we can articulate. They help people be more successful in sticking in the labor market and having longer work durations and that sort of thing. But they're incredibly important economic issues. Part of our productivity issues are the fact that it's too hard for people to get to work, and they can't live near the places they work. So they tend to change jobs more frequently, and it's a big problem for companies in losing talent, having to retrain people. And so I think these issues are the same, and if we can move forward on things like transit, housing, immigrant settlement, and inclusion, I think then we'll begin to see a lot of these problems begin to be dealt with.
Any other thoughts from my panelists on this very important question?
Well, I'd agree with Alan. I think a lot of this is how do we connect people to the economic opportunities that we have, but not so disconnected to the previous question about the high-rise development downtown. It really points out the need to map out the urban region or the urban economy in this region. I don't think we understand well enough where business opportunities are located, where the connections, where the infrastructure has to be put in place to make sure that people can get to work, can get the
Who should
the
do that
types of-
mapping?
I think it has to be a collaborative activity. I think certainly municipalities across the region have to be involved, but so too do social organizations, so too does business, and the businesses that are using these people or that are providing an opportunity for people to be employed, for training. I mean, this is even on the training side. It's very difficult to move a person across the GTA simply to go to school. And that's something that we have to correct some way.
Yeah. No, this
here,
a lot of this is coming back to this transit infrastructure. Jaana, any other comments on this? Because the last question I'm going to is to start with you.
So why don't we move on?
I'll move on to this question because I'm...
Sorry, I'll
yeah.
maybe
Okay,
do
Lorne.
one last comment that might be helpful. Public transportation is a huge component. There were 3 items mentioned. And I would say when I look at the experience of these 65 cities that I mentioned earlier around the world, they are doing the highest form of mixed-use development around their transit nodes. And they're spectacular. They're absolutely spectacular. As spectacular as the Eaton Center was 30 years ago or 40 years ago when they opened it, there's sort of 3 levels from that level where it not only includes commercial, it includes residential, it includes, you know, the whole integration. And if you take what's going on here in Toronto right now with the discussions on one city and et cetera, I mean, we still don't even have an umbrella organization that's coordinating all the component parts. I mean, I'm running into, as the CEO of Build Toronto, situations where you have the TTC that's doing their thing, and you know, the TTC for many years were held out as probably the best in the world. If you look at their cost per ridership 30 years ago, it was very good. But it has not changed. And the world has changed. And the way we house people, the way we integrate it, the way we do mixed use, and how we fund that. The funding isn't the issue. The funding doesn't have to come from the public sector. Let the private sector do their thing and their expertise because they can do it a lot better. But get the vehicle for governance to coordinate.
Thank you. Certain themes are re-emerging here. I was asked to save some time for audience discussion, participant discussion here, so I want to conclude with a question where I'm going to put everyone here on the spot. Yesterday, it seemed to me that there was agreement in the room that Toronto's an alpha city, a world-class city. But we said we undermarket ourselves. We have to learn to take a region-wide approach, which has been mentioned several times this morning. So here's my question. I'll start with you, Jaana. If you were queen for a day, or king for a day to the rest of the panel, or if you had the power for the hour, what would you specifically change? Now, Jaana, your priorities for action will be based on your understanding and your global understanding of initiatives around the world. And then I'm going to ask each of you to say what you would specifically change. And it can't be a general thing like I'd improve alignment. It has to be specific.
Okay. Clearly, I'm not a Toronto expert, so take it for what it's worth. But the first thing would be actually a compliment to Toronto. Continue doing something that I think you do very well, that you and pioneered, which is knowing thyself. In a way, not only doing analysis of what companies and what your citizens like or don't like, where do you spend too much money or too little, is actually extremely important. And I actually continue to follow your annual competitiveness reports, and I particularly like that you don't just benchmark Toronto to other Canadian or even North American cities. You set the bar where it should be. So my first decision would be I would definitely continue to fund that effort and make sure that you focus the resources to the areas that need it the most. two others come from, I think, our global work. I may say that I'm a little, I think Toronto is a great city and a very attractive city in many ways, and I think it has two areas where it could really build on the opportunity. The first one is talent, your kind of internal talent, and your migration policies are an admiration of not only your southern neighbor, but of many other people as well, in its capacity to really bring in talented folks. I think you can do more of that, and I think one of the things you mentioned, which is the cost of living, particularly for, let's say, technical talent, matters a great deal. The three countries that have been exceptionally successful in software and IT, for example, all had engineers at a relatively affordable cost, largely because, in a way, housing cost was one of the big factors. Israel, after the defense downsizing a lot of engineers that were looking for private sector. India, obviously, you know for what reason, their education system. And Ireland for a lot of the migration and talent focus there. So I think talent would be one, I think, and making sure that this is the place to be in North America for talented, young, exciting, and entrepreneurial folks.
Continues to know ourselves, focus on talent attraction, address the affordability issues.
Yes.
Jay, three things, quick.
I live in Aberfoyle, population 100. My business left downtown Toronto 20 years ago. It's now located at the airport. Improve urban transportation infrastructure.
Is that all three of your ideas?
Yes.
Okay. Alan.
Well, I think the biggest problem that we have in this city, and I think we have them generally in Canadian cities, is we lack fiscal capability, and we don't have control of our destiny, because every time we want to do something big, we have to go to a provincial or federal government and get them to agree. And they very often, almost always, have different priorities, different interests, different political pressures. And so what I would do was give king for a day. I would give Canadian cities the right to levy sales tax and the right to levy income tax.
Both?
Both. Both.
Whoa.
You
might not get elected, but...
Well, the second thing I would do, because I'm king for the full day, I would do that in the morning. And then in the afternoon, I would infuse our politicians with the courage to levy those taxes and the courage to go to the electorate and to say, this is what this tax is going to be, this is what we need it for, and to be persuasive around that case. It's interesting to me that when at the Institute on Municipal Finance and Governance, we did a series of talks on transit funding where we brought in experts from other places. And one of the experts was John English from the Utah Transit Authority. And he talked about the referenda they do. And they do it in the Salt Lake City area, but they're also being done in Houston and Portland and other places, where they use a referendum to go to the public to ask for them to tax themselves to build a transit line, and they describe where the transit line is and all the details of the operation. They do very good marketing campaigns when they do it, and typically these things are being approved by 70–80% in those referenda. So people are prepared to pay for the benefits if they clearly see the benefits, and I think our politicians can have the courage and take courage to be able to do that. So that's what I would do.
And on the sales tax, if I can just put a little postscript, I had done a lot of work on that. I totally agree with it, but it would have to be to a limit of about 0.5% or 1%. It would have to be region-wide, so you don't get people leaving the region to buy major purchases. But it is possible, and it would yield a certain amount of money, not all that we need for the transit, but a big chunk. Lorne, you've got the power for the hour. What would you do?
Well, thank you. Well, I've got three ideas. Let me start out with the first one, is that we have many good organizations that operate very much in their own area or their own sphere. I would call that a silo. I think we need to find a way to incentivize certain silos in the public sector so they are strongly encouraged to look beyond their individual priority. And I think we ought to find a way to do that.
And the silos?
And the silos. Secondly, real estate is such a hidden asset, particularly at the city level. At the city level, because it's a longer term thing and it's risk management, often there is not the real estate excellence that's required to manage that risk and make things happen. So we really have to find new forms of governance in terms of melding together the control and direction of the public sector, which is important, which we have to hang on to. But we also have to be able to attract the talent on the private sector that's going to bring the expertise and be able to bridge that cycle beyond the 4 years of the political. And lastly, I would come back to one of the points that Alan made in terms of public transportation. It is so critical. I mean, if you look at the city and the amount of money that they have invested in dormant real estate, it is mind-boggling. When you take the large pension funds now that will invest anywhere from a low of 10% to as high as 15, 17% of their total investment, they're doing that for a reason, because there's an opportunity in real estate. And yet here we have city administration, city departments, city balance sheets that I would guess they're less than 5%. It's a big opportunity being missed. And the incremental spin-off, if it's done correctly in terms of mixed-use development over these transportation nodes, is huge.
You know, it strikes me that your 3 points, Lorne, come together. The focus on public transit, the idea of leveraging and maximizing private sector money and expertise, all is part of ending the silos. So there is a convergence. I was asked to save time for your questions and discussion and comments, and we do have 5 minutes and 17 seconds left. So just following my instructions.
Yeah.
Questions or comments? Yes.
A little bit nervous when I hear conversations about long-term projects lasting 4 to 5 years, and maybe that's because I'm an emerging, aspiring economic leader. So I wonder the comments on how do we actually get municipal leaders and governments to think about long-term strategy past election mandates, and also past, I think public-private partnerships are an incredible opportunity. I've seen the impact in my own community in London, Ontario, bringing in corporate partners to have infrastructure projects make a big difference in the community. But I'm wondering, with quarterly shareholder returns and 4-year election mandates, how do we start to think about long-term infrastructure investments beyond those parameters for the greater good of the city 20, 30, 40 years from now?
So this is a big nut to crack. Comments?
Well, I think Lorne suggested a few minutes ago in terms of governance change. One of the things that the city did was create Build Toronto, which is a wholly owned corporation of the city, but is intended to create that distance between the kind of political cycles and the real estate management development efforts.
I think the Waterfront Commission would be another positive example.
Yeah. And a lot of places they have development corporations that they create, or standalone corporations that they create. They're wholly owned by the city, but they're less prone to the kind of political cycles.
Yeah, and on the governance model there's 12 people on the board, and 6 are from the public side, which represents the public perspective, and the other 6 are the professional real estate people, and that's who I take my direction and make day-to-day decisions around governance and investment and so on. And that's the methodology that's used there to bridge that timeline. I came on board 3 years ago, and I have projects today that I'm continuing to work on that it's going to be probably at least another year before we start construction. So it's gone the entire 4-year period, and there's been nothing actually physically constructed.
Good planning does take a long time. So through ABCs, boards and commissions, Jaana?
An interesting idea that I think the Rio mayor has used for doing exactly that was, and I think he's quite explicit about it is that you can nest your plans into long-term visions that go very far, 20 years, even beyond that. If you make them very public, if there's something that you build a very strong consensus around, even beyond the election cycle, in a way, the citizens are going to be watching for how the city is going to be responding to these goals. So I thought that was one interesting way of building community and broad consensus that this is the vision where we are headed, and that is going to be very hard for others following to break.
I would just say also from business, what a business would do is to form a separate business unit that would be charged then with a longer term perspective with some stable funding. And I think there are a number of successful models where you can build a collaborative business with joint funding, joint investment. But if that's the model we're going to, the commission model or whatever it is, then we have to, I think, have some best practice. We have to accept that more generally as a governance structure.
But there's no question with big corporations that the quarterly pressure to report to shareholders is huge, and it is a big challenge. But there are positive examples.
Of public companies.
Public companies. I'm sorry. Yes, but there are positive examples. I think that's important, and we've named some. Additional questions? Yes, sir. Yes, that's you. Sorry.
I'm just wondering if, just maybe a point to Lorne, I'm wondering if cities have managed to find a way to capitalize on land.
Here's a mic.
If you've managed to find a way to capitalize on land value appreciation, once you announce a major infrastructure project like a subway station, land values increase. Is the city trying to find a way to try to capitalize on that as well as the private sector?
Oh, absolutely. We have a number of major projects where the City of Toronto Council, in their wisdom, have designated a property, for example, Yonge and Eglinton, where the subway stopped, the adjacent property, the old barns, is being transferred to Build Toronto. And in conjunction and working with the TTC in terms of respecting their technical requirements, we're looking to do a major mixed-use integrated development over top of the subway station. So that's very much a direction that we want to go. There are challenges in terms of going that direction because it's a very long-term project. I mean, ultimately, there'll be probably 4 million feet of development, including numerous residential towers and other commercial aspects, and it just takes time. But if you can do a proper job as a developer in terms of selling your board on the vision and also selling your major shareholder, that we have the technology in terms of how to do this correctly, and that in the long haul it creates huge amounts of value for the sole shareholder, but also tremendous convenience to the marketplace and to the local community, and something that we can all be very proud of.
One last question here.
Thank you, Catherine Soplet. I'm here from, I live in the city of Mississauga. The question or comment has to do with the land use and connects to access to secondary schools, which are important when you're trying to attract talent because CEOs have kids in high school. Since 1996, the city of
I've got about 10 seconds left, so you have to just ask the quick question.
Okay. I'll skim it.
Oh, sorry, I'm driven by the clock here. We've run out of time, so I want to thank my panel. I've enjoyed the discussion, and I hope that you found it useful. Thank you very, very much.